Okay, hello everybody. I'm James Douet. I'm speaking to you from Barcelona in Spain. I'm an industrial heritage consultant, which means I'm contracted to do research, documentation, conservation programs on sites and on particular sectors such as the oil industry. I'm just going to move the slide forward. So my contribution aims to provide some wider geographical and historical context by which the heritage of the oil industry, the history of oil production can be considered. And that's based on a report which I did last year for TICCIH. TICCIH, as you may have heard my colleague mention earlier on, is the International Association for the Conservation of Industrial Heritage. And we advise ICOMOS, we provide information for ICOMOS when it's in turn advising UNESCO on the assessment of nominations for the World Heritage Site. So we've done a number of these thematic studies, as they're called, over the years. Canals, railways, typically sites and in sectors which are underrepresented, as the previous speaker mentioned, and less well understood than others, to assist ICOMOS when it receives nominations, and they're not quite sure on which basis they should be assessed. So this study was initiated by your colleagues in Ontario, the oil field site, very important early site, contemporaneous with you, down in Canada, as Gary explained. And it was published last year. It was due to be presented at a seminar at the oil field site in August this year. Unfortunately, our international conference in Montreal was cancelled. It'll be postponed. So this will be presented, hopefully, if things carry on improving, in August next year. So as with other global industries, it's a help with international perspective to gain an understanding of how important these assets are, historical assets, relative to other ones, so that you can find a more solid assessment of what survives and how significant it is. So typically these studies have three parts. The first part is a historical study. And I should mention that this document can be downloaded from the TICCIH webpage. If you go into TICCIH.org and into publications, you can find where all these various thematic reports are, and you can download this. So the first part is a historical study of the industry. Second part will try and identify the key themes, the key narrative themes, and the most significant technologies running through that industry. And the third main part will try and propose some priorities for what should be conserved, assuming sites survive in some degree of authenticity and integrity. So at the moment, there's nothing on the World Heritage List, as we've already heard. There are two or three places which are on different tentative lists. There's an oil settlement in Bahrain, the Wali. There are other sites in Arabia. The Saudi Arabians are very keen to include part of the tap line, perhaps a refinery. In Latin America, Canada, the Canadian site I mentioned, is hoping to become on the Canadian tentative list. But what everyone's finding is that there's an enormous gap between the undoubted historical significance, as we just heard, of this industry and the evidence, the historical evidence that survives. I'll just read a paragraph, a couple of lines from the report, which says, partly because of the way in which oil, gas, and petrochemicals were produced, there's a huge gap between the undoubted historical significance of the industry and the very small number and size of the sites, structured landscapes which have survived as testimony and evidence for it. A global overview, therefore, may help to identify the most outstanding or representative heritage assets to shape the narrative around these places and to direct sufficient resources toward their conservation and protection. So this is just a fairly typical view of a oil heritage site. Move on to the next slide. And it reminds us that while chimneys, which are the classic symbol of industrialization, industrial production, and are widely conserved, or they made this a bit widely conserved as an icon of industrialization. The equivalent, which is the derrick, here they are. This is a Baku in Azerbaijan, but it could be any number of landscapes from the 19th century. Virtually none of these survive. It's almost impossible to find an original derrick, especially from this period, surviving in any sort of condition. Here's another view. This is the beach in California at the beginning of the 20th century, once oil was discovered there. So what the TICCIH study did was to divide up the industry into the typical three divisions that the oil industry uses: upstream, midstream, and downstream sites, to try and get an understanding of what is important. Although we should remember that as Professor Carola Hind, who's one of the leading academics in this field, she's defined what she calls the global petroleum scape, which emphasizes how interconnected the sites from these three sectors actually are. She says oil drilling equipment, refineries, storage tanks, pipelines, dedicated road and rail infrastructure, and gas stations serve the physical flows of oil in industrial areas as well as in everyday life. So although we can divide up the industry into smaller segments, small typologies of sites, we should remember how extraordinarily interconnected the entire area of the petroleum scape is. So we came up with five sort of main historical narratives for the industry. This is the Awali settlement in Bahrain. So the earliest one would be simple pre-industrial petroleum harvesting. This is the collecting of oil from seeps, natural seeps, some artisanal production. You find these going back into the very earliest civilizations in the Middle East, where these materials were used for lighting and for construction. And it's not till the 1860s that what's referred to as the Pennsylvania model of oil production comes into operation, named after the earliest sites in Pennsylvania, and of course across the Lake Ontario in Canada. First production site. This is where the model which shaped the industry for the first 30, 40 years was pioneered, and we get oil wells, oil fields, first pipelines. And this reminds us how very rare and fragile these sites are. This is the Drake's well. We'll hear more about this later on today. It's a reproduction based on documentary materials, but I don't think any of the material here, my colleague will correct me, is in fact from the 1860s. And of course, the landscape totally different. Everyone will be familiar with views of Pennsylvania in the end of the 19th century. It looked completely different to how it does now. This is the second historical narrative. The third one, this is part of the jerker wheel system from oil springs in Ontario. In the third part, you see how the oil industry spreads globally. From 1900, you get international transfer, such as Gary was describing with from Canada to Poland, and new regional concentrations of oil production and consequent urban development and settlements being developed. Here in Estonia, this is part of the oil shale production sites in Estonia, one of the rare pieces of oil landscape which has survived, partly because it's so difficult to get rid of. Or indeed in the North Sea, this is one of the giant troll platforms for accessing North Sea, and Norway, of course, another important regional concentration in the industry. From 1814, you get the spread of oil as the global energy source, replacing coal as the petroleum scape, as Professor Heine described it, spreads throughout the world on the back of the motor car and asphalt road production. And finally, petrochemicals, perhaps the most controversial of the narratives of oil production from the 1950s. The use of petroleum as a feedstock for plastics, fertilizer, and numerous other products, which have so completely dominated our own societies. So that leads on to the next problem of what you can do, what sort of sites can be identified which might be survived. And here we find the real problem with the heritage of the oil industry. Many of these sites are extremely fragile. They were subject to corrosion. They were subject to rapid obsolescence and reconstruction. Some, like these, are ephemeral. When the oil stops coming out of the ground, they disappear. Others, like refineries, are quite the reverse. Places like Baton Rouge refinery started in, I think, in 1916, still in use. And the many refineries like this around the world, where continual use and updating means it's very hard to find anything which is historical in the usual sense, or authentic in the sense that UNESCO understand it. So, what priorities should we impose on this curious heritage? So, if the upstream sector, I think quite clearly evidence of pre-industrial production. Very rare these are of great interest. Production phase from the 1860s to 1900s. This is Baku. Again, if historically original, authentic material can be found, this is an extremely important period in the development of the oil industry. A third section might be the regional and national concentrations which developed. This is the Turner gas plant in Alberta. One could mention Baku, Abadan, Sumatra, Argentina, Norway, numerous regional concentrations which have their own interesting urbanization systems. And these, in turn, are probably the richest area of clear testimony for the oil industry. The settlements which were built often in isolated areas where there were low population, and the oil companies were obliged to provide settlements. Very large architecture firms grew up. I'm working on an exhibition for the University in Texas of the biggest of these architecture companies, who are building these planned settlements throughout the world. This is in Venezuela, often using interesting architects, international architects, with importing planning and social values from Europe and North America to other areas. And so this is a very interesting field as part of the heritage. Of the midstream sector, pipelines, quite an unusual idea in terms of heritage, obviously a long way from the Taj Mahal and the cathedrals, which the early World Heritage lists will consist of. But extremely interesting. This is the tap line stretching from one side of Arabia to other in order to spread Saudi Arabian oil and get it to the Mediterranean. This was accompanied by a whole series of settlements, pumping stations built by often American oil architecture companies. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, another technically very advanced and interesting structure. And alongside the pipelines, obviously, ports, Galveston, Aberdeen, Stavanger, these are major installations which are extraordinarily important in the diffusion of petroleum around the world. Finally, the third sector, the downstream section, refineries, I've already mentioned. One could mention Philadelphia. It's another one that's been going on for decades. Very important in getting the Pennsylvania oil out at the beginning of the 20th century through and to the rest of the world. A stronger field for traditional heritage conservation might be the corporate headquarters of the oil companies. The oil companies, Standard Oil in the vanguard, were extraordinarily influential in the diffusion of oil culture, oil techniques, as we heard through Mugabe's company, Standard Oil, the great rivals. And this is their headquarters built in Manhattan, one of the early corporate headquarters, and of course dwarfed by later buildings. But you can look in similar buildings in this is London. This is the British Petroleum headquarters in London, built by the leading imperial architect of the period. And if you want to go up to date, this is Gazprom's proposed corporate headquarters in St. Petersburg. I'm not sure whether this has been built yet, but you can see how these really speak of the power, the wealth, and the influence of the oil industry throughout the 20th. And finally, filling stations, ubiquitous, found throughout the world. Many of them extremely ephemeral and of no particular interest, but occasionally they are built either to corporate designs following particular branding strategies of the oil companies, or occasionally like this one. This is in Ethiopia, built by the Italian oil company. A very spectacular piece of modern architecture. Or in Helsinki, another piece of modern architecture, really using the design of the architecture of the filling station to promote the sale of the product. So we haven't got a lot of time. What conclusions might we bring from all this? how to recognize, value, appreciate, and protect the historical sites which are associated with production of petroleum and its products. And of course, we have to look at what UNESCO has to say. They're the ones who are laying down the ground rules for this process. And they're looking for cultural and/or natural significance so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. So the importance of the historical evidence is self-evident, but it's also very demanding from a conservation standpoint. The scale of production plants can be enormous. Technological change, the corrosive environment in which these plants survive. Technological change is very rapid. Ephemeral construction materials, all those wooden derricks, nothing survived because they were so flimsy. Very much fight against the key concepts of UNESCO of authenticity and integrity. Usually these are found within the materials of the historical sites, but of course steel, timber are not typically very long-lasting materials. Once obsolete, these places very rarely get looked after, and they're often extremely hard, with the exception of some of the architectural sites, to repurpose for some future use. Arguably, we should look into the influence of the heritage industry onto global warming. Climate change is a big issue for, they said in 1973, I think, no, it must be later, 2010. Climate change has emerged as one of the most serious threats impacting on the conservation of our world. The petrochemical industry have a major part to say in that. Documentation will be, in many cases, the only suitable way to conserve an understanding of these large sites. Technical industrial museums should be active, site very, very, very admirably so, conserving key examples of the technology. And even very large structures like oil rigs. I know the National Museum in Scotland conserving iconic elements such as the flare tip of a major oil platform as a symbol of the whole structure, which is obviously far too big to conserve. Buildings and architecture, such as the ones I've shown, will be the most sustainable way to preserve some testimonies of the importance of petroleum over the last century. But again, some selection will be necessary. There are many oil camp settlements and administration buildings, such as the ones I've suggested, and they need to be chosen with some care. And this is the point of the study, to try and assist the comparable studies of heritage to see what is important, what's special, and what's unusual. And here I think the key for this industry, for your sites, will be concepts of rarity and fragility. Pyramids will last for a very long time. The heritage of this industry is both rare and fragile. And I think these are the qualities which you'll really need to stress when putting forward a case for the conservation of the sites. But I think you've made an extremely good start, as the last speaker showed, in putting together a very strong case for how the heritage of this site might be conserved with the other examples on the World Heritage List. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope the rest of the conference goes as well as it's already gone.